Welcome to Goldfish on Games, and today I want to talk about the very first game that I bought with my own money for the PC. That game was obviously the absolutely amazing Settlers 2. Made by Byte in 1996, and thankfully also published by them all over the world, no more weird and alarming box art this time. This is the original UK DOS release of the game, and the box contains a game on a CD, the manual, and a Byte catalogue. The manual has a nice personal message from the producers of the game, and really gives you the idea that this was a passion project for them, and goes into great detail on the game. It really is very useful to have to hand while playing the game, and I love the fact that it's a full colour manual as well. And I really enjoy looking through these catalogues and seeing the games that were already out or due to be released, to see how much they would have cost back in the day. Thankfully, this game was also released in an era where the CD was the copy protection. There was no password protection, looking up codes or any of that pain. As long as the CD was in the drive, you could play. I also happen to have the expansion pack, but I've only got the CD of this as the box got water damaged many years ago. And if you take a look at the back of the box, we can see what is probably one of the most overworked marketing blurbs I think I've ever seen on a box, as they're trying to work in the Settlers name there. Oh, it's just a little bit painful. After installing the game using Byte's custom installer, we are very quickly in game, which instantly shows us things have changed, as the intro is now actually telling a very specific story, and is set up for the single player game, rather than just being there because it's nice to watch.
The Tortius no longer exists. What remains of my trusty ship is now driftwood, sandy coastal bank of this unknown island. The stars tell me that we are nowhere near the familiar trading routes.
Now from the main menu, we can see we have a campaign as well as the unlimited mode, which is where we can start a custom game that is either single or multiplayer. After the intro, the rest of the story is all provided by in-game text boxes, and the odd image from time to time. It tells the story of a Roman ship captain who is shipwrecked and is trying to make his way back home via a set of portals that you can find in each of the maps. Normally these are deep inside your opponent's territory. How you get there and how long it takes is fully up to you. But it seems this wasn't always the case, as early on in development the game was going to be far more scripted, with timed events and maps designed with a more rigid playstyle in mind. Thankfully this was dropped, as it really wouldn't have felt like Settlers. But you can still see hints of this in the final game, where you'll get messages when you expand into certain areas, and this will give you more of the story as well as unlock some of the buildings, as well as giving you hints of where the portal is in the map. And as these tend to be quite close to the start of each map, you're not likely to miss out of any of it. As we can see, the UI was suitably themed to match the new Roman time frame, with a marble-like effect and statues in the corner of the screen holding it all together. Taking ideas from operating systems and a few other sim games of the time, the UI was more dialogue driven, as in you can have multiple windows open and interact with the main game or any of the windows at the same time. This made it much easier to play, as well as jumping around the map. Anyone who's played Settlers will recognise the basics, and if you don't know the basics, I did a video about Settlers 1 that might help. There'll be a link in the description. Once again, we start with a castle with all our resources already inside, and our building area is limited by the markers. These can only be expanded by using military buildings, but we can expand the fog of war by using watchtowers or via the new scout. These are sent out from flags just like we do with geologists. Building is mostly the same. You'll still need wood and stone, but there's now 3 different building sizes. You have the small, the medium and the large. These are all easily spotted when you hit the spacebar or enable the helper mode when you're placing buildings down. Thankfully, new Settlers are produced at a much higher rate than before, and it's rare to get into situations where you have roads that have no one on them. And speaking of roads, when you're building one, you can just click where you want it to go, and it will lay down usually the best route for you automatically. But you can still place each segment individually by hand if you want, which can be useful if you're aiming for very particular flagpoles. Another improvement to the road network is that roads are no longer limited to having a single settler walking along them at once. You can have a knight travelling to an outpost, a carrier moving his goods around, as well as a donkey helping him out. This greatly speeds up the flow of all your roads and makes it so much easier for people to get where they need to be. One downgrade has to be the rowboats. These now have a very strict max length and never really feel like they're quite long enough. This seems to be on purpose, as it means you have to build up water networks over to other islands using the newer, larger transport ships. These are launched from docks, which act just like storehouses. This is one of the larger new features of the game, and it allows you to set sail across the waters to settle new islands and lands, and these transport ships will pretty much take anything across the water. Once you've built a boat, and you've gathered enough resources to start an expedition, you can launch your ship. It will go off and try and find a suitable area to create a new dock, and from there you can start building up your new settlement. But unfortunately, this ends up being one of the buggier parts of the game. Ships don't always seem to transfer the goods and people that you expect. And if you have two harbours on the same bit of land, they can sometimes get quite confused over how you're meant to move the goods around. This was improved with some of the patches and the gold release, but it was never fully fixed, and ended up being probably the most requested area for improvement for any sequel. For the most part, many of the resource trees saw little change. To make tools you still needed iron bars and coal and wood, which were all produced at very similar buildings as before. But there were a few shortcuts that were added in to help, as there's now the hunter, who will go out and find little critters running around the map and produce meat. Though this is a very limited resource, so you can't really rely on it. And it's interesting to see that the most complex item, the knight, was made even more complex. You now not only need a sword and shield, but you also need beer, which is produced at a brewery which requires water and wheat to produce. Gold was also completely changed. Gone is that weird percentages of strength between being in and out of your territory, which would be increased by the amount of gold that you happen to have sat around. Instead, coins are produced. These are then taken to a military building and pays for training, and will promote the soldiers inside that building. So it tends to be useful to make sure that only the buildings near the enemy get gold, so you have trained knights ready to take them on. But knights are not your only weapon in this game. There is now the stationary catapults, which will send stone flying through the air. These will only target military buildings, and if it happens to get a hit, one of the knights inside that building will be killed. It doesn't matter their strength or level, they are dead instantly. And if that happens to be the last knight inside that building, then it'll actually get destroyed. As you can imagine, these are great along your border, but as soon as you really start pushing into enemy territory, they become less and less useful, though you do still have to worry about enemy catapults taking out your own buildings. The two-player mode from the original game was carried over, but now we have larger maps as well as higher resolutions to mess around with, which makes the game even more fun than ever before. So many of the games I used to play with my mates would last 20 plus hours, but typically end in a stalemate, but we still enjoyed it all the same. To play this game, you really need to play it in DOS and use a PS2 mouse as well as a serial mouse. Settlers 2 actually has its own mouse driver built in to detect the second mouse, which can be picky, so it's best to get your DOS mouse driver to detect the PS2 one and leave Settlers to detect the serial one, or vice versa if you're having problems. I can remember having to get a patch on a floppy disk from Byte to get this to work with the serial mouse that I happen to have. The game will really eat up your RAM in this mode, particularly if you play on some of the larger maps, as it's quite possible for it to crash when you're deep in a game if it runs out of free memory. So make sure you've got 32 megabytes of RAM or more if you're going to play some of the larger two-player maps. As we saw the expansion disc at the beginning of this episode, I thought it'd be interesting to have a look at the imaginatively named Mission CD, which added a new single-player campaign that takes place over 9 maps, which challenges you to take over the whole world, where you'll start in Europe before moving on. 12 new maps were also added for the free mode, which was renamed Unlimited mode, and the most exciting part to me was they added a level editor. I'll do a whole video on the editor at some point, but let's just say it was really easy to use. And with a bit of renaming and a bit of file moving around, you could actually edit all the original game maps. So if you really wanted, you could actually cheat a little bit by giving you far more resources when you start. The game was initially released for MS-DOS and didn't really get any ports for almost 11 years, when a version was released for the Nintendo DS. Even though it was actually just named The Settlers, it actually was a full port of Settlers 2. Though, looking at the reviews at the time, it didn't do too well, which I have to admit doesn't entirely surprise me, seeing they must have done a lot of work to try and compress that to fit on a machine with so little RAM. It also got a remake in 2006, with the Settlers 2 10th Anniversary Edition, in which they completely rewrote the story. No longer are you shipwrecked and having to travel through portals to get home. Instead, all the women of the world have vanished, and you're having to travel through the portals to try and find out where they've gone. The game was actually based on the original codebase, but added a very nice 3D engine on top, and actually did a really good job of animating the settlers. I have to admit, I'm a massive fan of the original 2D artwork, but I actually don't mind the new look, and the ability to zoom in and out is a really nice touch. But as it was based on the classic gameplay, it is missing some of the nicer features that was added later on in the series, such as being able to set work zones. So at times the modern graphics can feel a little at odds with the older gameplay. And recently Ubisoft has decided to release the Settlers History Edition, which includes an updated Settlers 2. This was based on the classic gold release of the game and not the remake. So it has all the missions from the original game, as well as the expansion, as well as the level editor. And it was all updated to run on a modern system, at higher resolution, but it lacks the CD music. But as there's no scaling options, the game will run pretty much at native resolution, which means when you're running at really high resolutions, some of the settlers can get very tiny, as well as some of the icons that you have to click on, which can make it quite difficult to play. There's also some issues with sound. The new male sound is just broken, and other sound effects just feel like they're missing. And this neatly leads us up to how to play the game now. You can get Settlers 2 Gold Edition as well as the 10th Anniversary on GOG, and both run pretty well on modern systems. And the History Edition can be gotten from Uplay. If they added pixel scaling as well as fixed the sound issues, I would say go for the History Edition in a heartbeat. But as it stands, I think the gold version is still best. But then that's what I grew up on at the time. But no matter how you decide to play the game, you will find an amazing title just waiting for you to try out. And there we have it. Probably the peak of the series, at least for me, and the best sequel ever made. It was so good that I continue to come back to it 10, 15 years later. It's that good a game. And until next time, I've been the Goldfish. That was a bunch of settlers who came, who saw, and who conquered. And this was Goldfish on Games. Now if you excuse me, I'm going to go and play another map. Goodbye. Thank you for watching my video on Settlers 2. I really do love this game. And if you enjoyed the video, please consider giving me a thumbs up or even a comment. I'm trying to put out a video every week. So if you subscribe, you'll find out when the new videos go live before anyone else.